Waterfall, the CCW podcast.
Welcome to a fresh new episode of Waterfall, the water saving podcast brought to you by CCW, Consumer Council for Water, the go-to place for all of your consumer-related water needs, inquiries and views. So today we have got me, Cath, with you, as well as Karen.
Hello, Cath.
Hi, Karen. And Tom.
Hi everyone, hi listeners, hi Karen, hi Cath.
So we've got ever such an exciting episode today where we are speaking to some people who I had not even heard of before, and I learnt a lot about moss. Karen, who are we talking to?
Well, we're talking to people that really care about retaining as much water as possible in the natural environment and are playing a really active part in making sure that areas that are natural sort of sponges for water are continuing to remain healthy and helping with all kinds of aspects of water supply and flood management as well. So it's a really fascinating episode, and it just makes the case for why it's so important that we leave as much water as possible in the natural environment.
Absolutely. So it's the Moors for the Future partnership we have on today. As Karen says, hugely important in leaving water in the environment. We talk all about saving water and how that can save us money at home, but this is the other end of it. Not using the water leaves it there for nature. Hopefully people will learn a lot from this. I certainly did.
Yeah, and just before we get into our interview, of course, I just want to push people to do several things. They can help the show. They can subscribe, they can tell a friend, they can go through the archive. You know, we've got tens of hours available there. You know, lots of laughs with Mike, Karen and Cath and other assorted CCW members and guests. We're on Spotify, we're on iTunes. You can leave us a review over there. You can check out what other people have said. And yeah, just kind of embrace all the waterfall goodness we've got in there. But I think we should just now cut straight to the guest. This is Moors for the Future. So, channel your inner Mike here, dear listener. But let's bring on the guest.
CCW. Passionate about championing the best interests of everyone who uses water, now and in the future.
So we're joined today by Tom Spencer, who's a Senior Research and Monitoring Officer for the Moors for the Future partnership. Welcome, Tom.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So could you tell us, firstly, Tom, a little bit about what it is? What does Moors for the Future partnership do?
So Moors for the Future partnership exists with a remit to restore degraded blanket bogs in the Peak District and South Pennines, which is the area where we work. So we've been doing that for the last 20 years, covering a very large area and putting poor condition peatlands on a positive trajectory towards recovery and restoring their ecosystem functions.
Oh, wow. Well, that sounds quite intense. I've got to ask, Tom, my very first question is, what is a blanket bog? I did say to my colleagues, I wondered if it was like a repository for old cellular blankets, but I don't think that is quite right.
Hopefully not. We would consider that as littering. Blanket bogs are peatlands. They're specifically areas where we have deep peat deposits. They're always in the uplands. So they tend to be on plateaus and hill formations like that. So they're blankets of peat, essentially, draped over upland topography. They're fed by rainwater. They tend to be very wet places with therefore wet-loving vegetation species, and they support a wide range of wildlife species, insects, birds, reptiles, small mammals, that kind of thing. Yeah.
And I wonder if you could explain, how the depletion of those areas impacts water and wastewater services?
Yeah, in terms of water supply, good condition peatlands, which are wet places with wet-loving vegetation species, in particular a moss called sphagnum, which we'll talk about a bit more in a bit. They tend to provide clean water out of those catchments. Whereas if you've got degradation and erosion, then you've got particles of peat being washed out of those systems into the water. And so that's going to then contaminate that drinking water supply, which is it's not irreversible. It can be treated by water companies and reservoirs and treatment works, but there's a cost associated with that. So the cause of degradation is complex. It's different in different places according to what's going on, specifically on those peatlands and in the areas around them. In the Peak District, which is where Water of the Future operates, predominantly in South Pennines, a really key factor in peatland degradation was the Industrial Revolution. So the Peak District is surrounded by large urban areas where there was heavy industry in the Industrial Revolution, so metal works and coal burning for cotton mills, essentially industry like that. So that's deposited large amounts of pollutants onto that sensitive, fragile landscape in the form of acid rain and containing other pollutants as well. So that contamination landing on sensitive species such as sphagnum has caused widespread loss of vegetation. So we had very large areas of completely bare peat up until relatively recently, up until around 2000, just after that, and that's because the soil conditions deteriorated with those pollutants to the point that those sensitive vegetation species just couldn't survive. And once they'd been lost, that then exposed the bare peat. Peat itself is very loose, so once it's exposed to the air, it starts drying out and is really vulnerable to erosion by water, essentially. So if you get water landing in the form of snow and then freezing, that will cause freeze thaw erosion, so lifting peat out of the peat mass. Then when that thaws, it washes off into the streams. If we get heavy rain, then the impact of those raindrops will also wash peat off the surface and into the streams. If we get severe heat, so drought periods, then the peat itself will dry out and can blow off as dust into the streams. Then when it rains, that washes off as well. So there's basically, in any kind of extreme weather, in terms of temperature, we get peat loss from the surface where that peat is exposed. But essentially, the situation that we were faced with around 2000, just after that, was this widespread bare peat and really deep erosion gullies. So we've lost a huge amount of carbon across this landscape, which has all gone, as in the form of peat soil, into our water supply. And then being cleaned out by the water companies before it's delivered as drinking water.
Wow. But, I hadn't realised quite how much of these blanket peat bogs that we actually had in the UK. It's clearly a hugely important resource, and it must be fixed, because otherwise this cycle continues until we have no peat bog. All of that carbon's lost. We've lost all of the wildlife and the whole ecosystem that goes with that. And when I was doing a bit of background reading on this, Tom, I read that it takes something like a decade to form 1 centimetre of peat. What does Moors for the Future Partnership do to fix this?
Yeah, that accumulation rate that you talk about that's the one that is standardly used, about 1 millimetre a year. So 3 metres is 3,000 years of peat accumulation. It's probably more than that because the peat compresses over time. So the peat at the bottom of that 3 metres is compressed a lot more than the peat at the top. So we're talking like multiple millennia of peat accumulation that has washed off in the last couple of 100 years. So it's not a great start.
No.
I work for the science team at More for the Future, and there are some absolutely fascinating things that we've found from our science work, which is based around restoration work. So that our restoration teams work to restore bogs around Peak District and South Pennines using a range of techniques to try and achieve various outcomes. The bottom line that we're aiming for is to return this landscape into a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And from that point, the landscape can look after itself. It can return to a resilient state. We just need to intervene to undo some of the damage that we've caused over the last couple of 100 years. And in some ways, that's a completely overwhelming and impossible task, because we've got 3,000 years of peat loss, 3,000 years of peat which has been lost. We can't just put that back. So in that sense, it seems completely impossible. But actually, doing really simple things, we've found, has massive benefits, and surprisingly quickly as well in some ways. So the main thing that we do to areas of bare peat is to stabilize that. So bare peat is really vulnerable to erosion, as we said before. But if we get any vegetation on there, that erosion essentially switches off like a tap, and really quickly. So what we do, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive, is we plant lawn grass species on the peat, which is not there. So they're not natural moorland species, but they grow quickly. If we create the right conditions, we apply lime and we apply fertilizer, so those grasses will grow. And they will grow just for a few years. As soon as we stop applying that lime and fertilizer, they die off. But in that time, they've stabilized the surface, and more natural moorland species then have a microclimate that they can get back into. And by the time those nurse crop grasses die off, 3 to 5 years after they've been planted, those natural moorland species have come back in. The mosses have come back in. The surface is stabilized, and erosion of the peat has reduced, we've found, by about 97% within 18 months. So that's basically miraculous, I would say.
I think we'd agree.
So we just start a succession process. We put in those nurse crop grasses, and then succession takes place, with some exceptions. So the key moss that we talk about is sphagnum. That doesn't come back in because it's a really sensitive species, and it's been so extensively lost that it doesn't have a spore bank in the top surface of the peat anymore. So that doesn't come back in. So we plant some specific species like sphagnum and some other moorland shrubs. We plant some other, vascular plants, so cotton grasses, and sort of some forms of heather we plant as well.
Enjoying the show? Please consider leaving a 5-star rating on iTunes and Spotify.
I mean, as Karen just said, that kind of recovery rate, 97%, it's huge. And that it sounds like it's kind of self-sustaining. Once you've got this peat, it's almost like triage. It sounds like, you go in there, you intensively treat it to get it back to an all right position.
Yeah, I think one other thing to say about that is that how we look at successful restoration is I think it's also important to think about ecosystem function as opposed to like what the landscape looks like. Mm-hmm. So we've got these really deep gullies, which are a historic problem because a lot of carbon has been lost. And they have some ongoing problems in that deep gullies do contribute to drying out of the peat. But I think in terms of what we experience from these peatlands, what we receive from these peatlands, it's actually the surface condition that is most important. So where we've managed to get extensive cover of sphagnum, that is providing a lot of benefits already in terms of ecological function. So it's, where we've got those wet conditions, that's great for insects, that's therefore great for wading birds and birds of prey and all of this. It's also good for water quality. So we're seeing that 97% reduction in peat getting into the streams. That's an ecosystem benefit already. And the other key one is flood management. So we talk about natural flood management. We're all used to, hard engineered solutions to flooding, so concrete walls in places that flood. Natural flood management is, trying to deal with those kind of problems at headwater catchment source. The sphagnum can hold up to 80% its dry weight in water. That means that when we get really heavy rainfall, the water doesn't just rush off into the streams. it gets held up in the sphagnum, moves really slowly through that covering of sphagnum over those headwater catchments, takes them a lot longer to get into the streams, and therefore spreads out the delivery of stormwater into the rivers, which means that we're not getting all of the water from the uplands coming down into the rivers in a big flash. It's spread out over much more time, so that reduces the impact of flooding downstream, because we get a lower flood wave further down the rivers in places that flood. Obviously, that's very topical right now after Storm Babette just a few days ago. So yeah, we found so we have this experimental catchment on Kinder where we've done really dense sphagnum planting. We found that there, as a result of the sphagnum and the gully blocking that we've done there as well, we've had a 67 percentage point reduction in peak discharge. So that's the rate of flow coming out of that catchment at the peak of a storm is reduced by 67% as a result of those interventions. And it's delayed so the timing of that peak discharge is delayed by 680 percentage points as a result of that restoration. So if we were to do that intense restoration work across the whole landscape, we would see really significant reductions in flood severity at places downstream from these headwater catchments. And that's just because of surface treatment. So we don't have to fill in those gullies to get those benefits. No. You just have to treat the surface, which is much more manageable.
All the forecasts are that these extreme events are going to become more frequent occurrences. And I just think it's really interesting because, as we've discussed on previous episodes, it makes sense where we can to work with nature and natural systems as such to try to address some of the challenges that we're going to face in the future, because working with nature has got to be a far better solution than just simply thinking we can build things that are going to solve the problem. And quite clearly, they're adding to it, if anything.
Totally. It's the same, I would say, for natural flood management and also for, drinking water quality. If we can treat it up on the uplands, then it makes a much easier job further down the river at the water treatment works. If we're getting less contamination in the water arriving in the water treatment works, it's much easier to treat it. So like you say, working with nature is like holistically a much better idea than just trying to deal with causing problems for nature and then dealing with the outcomes of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, flood is very topical at the moment, as you say, following Storm Babette. I presume that the very extreme temperatures that we saw during 2022, for example, are going to make some of the work that you do even more challenging?
Yeah, the sphagnum is a really good example of that, I think. It needs constant moisture. It doesn't actually mind heat. It will grow in warm temperatures, but it's actually, the sphagnum that we plant is grown for us in polytunnels in warm temperatures, but with constant moisture. So if we get prolonged periods of drought, then that obviously causes more evaporation, so we will get less moisture. So that is potentially a problem for the sphagnum. But where we have extensive sphagnum cover, that's providing an insulating layer over the peat, cools the peat down underneath it, reduces evaporation. So actually the peat is staying wetter where we've got the sphagnum. So where again, it's another positive feedback loop. Where we don't have sphagnum, the peat is more vulnerable to drying out, it's more vulnerable to drought, it's therefore more vulnerable to wildfire. Where we've got extensive sphagnum is actually keeping that peat cool, it's keeping it wet, so it's making it more resilient to those drought periods and therefore more resilient to climate change. On a small scale, also has an albedo effect because bare peat is black, vegetation is much paler, so it's kind of, in a sense, it could have, if it was done on a large scale, it could have some kind of albedo effect as well. But I think the main thing is that sort of holding water on the surface, making our peatlands more resilient to drought. There's also a potential for protecting our drinking water supply in periods of drought as well, because again, where we just have bare peat or a a lack of rough surfaces like sphagnum, rainwater runs off quite quickly. So there's the water's kind of down into the reservoirs and through quite quickly. Whereas where we've got sphagnum, we've got this water surface held on the peat, which then releases slowly over a much longer period of time into the rivers. So actually we get a prolonged delivery of water into the reservoirs during dry periods where we have extensive sphagnum. So it's kind of making our landscape more resilient to climate change, but we've got to get in there quick before the conditions are so hostile that we can't get the sphagnum in there, if that makes sense.
There are so many clear benefits to protecting blanket bogs, and especially in related to, as you say, the water resilience, as well as the quality, and slowing the flow of rainwater, so stopping those floods. Do local water companies work with you on this?
Yeah, we have pretty strong working relationships with the water companies in our area. So in our work area, we work with Yorkshire Water and United Utilities and Severn Trent, and they're all involved in the work that we do because there are direct benefits to them. It makes total sense. You know, they invest money in the uplands and they save money at their treatment works. It's pretty simple, really. I'd say that all three of those companies really clearly recognise the benefits of the work that we do. They've observed those benefits financially and in terms of their workflows at their treatment works. So they're pretty strong advocates of peatland restoration in all three cases.
Excellent. That's great to hear that they're working with you, and there's such. You're right. It's such a win-win, isn't it? It's such an obvious thing that for us as an industry to be involved in.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, that's how our industry is involved. Are there things that we can do on an individual basis to help with this?
Yeah, so I would say, well, at a starting level, could volunteer with us. we have sort of a whole bunch of volunteering opportunities. Volunteers come out with Moors for the Future, also with other partners as well, like the National Trust and wildlife trusts have lots of volunteering opportunities on peatlands. That can be from doing the restoration work itself. So, you know, getting involved in planting sphagnum is a pretty great day out, I would say, as someone who likes being in those kind of places. Planting things in the rain, what's not to love? Volunteering, doing the practical stuff, which then obviously, you know, you're sort of contributing to a long legacy of improvement to these landscapes. For me, the other really key thing is about promoting awareness of these issues, and in particular the implications and problems associated with wildfires. Wildfires are started by humans. In the huge majority of cases, it's accidental and potentially unknowing as well. So the classic is disposable barbecues. So, you know, we get a nice warm spring day, people are like, oh great, it's nearly summer, let's go out for a barbecue. Not realizing that, you know, peat is a fuel. So if you get a spark or a really hot thing like a barbecue on peat, it could catch. Peat burns pretty well once it gets going, and that can cause, you know, huge areas of devastation essentially. So generally building awareness at a sort of public and societal level, which is something that we can all contribute to around these kind of issues, is really important. So yeah, I'd say being wildfire aware and spreading that message is a really key thing that we can all do. Obviously, that's easier or harder depending on, you know, how networked people are, but just building that awareness, I think, is really key.
Oh, well, hopefully this episode of Waterfall will help to get that message out.
Well, there you go, yeah. Don't use disposable barbecues on blanket bog or on any peat or on any moorland. It's not a good idea.
That's the takeaway.
Have a sandwich.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this today, Tom. I've genuinely learned loads just from this short half hour that we've had together. So, yeah, I will happily spread the word to raise awareness. And if I'm in the area, I think you might find me. I think both Karen and I are probably quite into planting sphagnum, rain or shine. We do have one question that we need to ask you, Tom. Do you know your personal water use?
I don't actually. We do have a water meter in our house. I don't actually know what our use is. I guess, yeah, it's. I think it's really important to be aware of water use. I do try to be careful with that. But I guess for me, sort of being involved in the kind of work that I do, I think like it's really highlighted to me that while it's great if we can all take our own personal responsibility for these things where we can, but the problems are on a much bigger scale. It's a societal level problem that we're talking about. So I think for me, what's really key is education and awareness raising at societal level, and pushing for systemic level change. Very much on top of personal level change. So, behavioural change is great. Systemic change is really the key. So, sort of pushing for restoration of peatlands through large scale state funding, and really going for it much faster than we are at the moment. There are huge successes which we've talked about over this podcast, but I think in the face of climate change and the rate that that's going, we really need to up our game and go at this really as fast as we can, and just put everything into restoring these landscapes, which will then look after our water much more than any of us can individually.
I don't think we disagree, Tom. It is incredibly important that we do move at a faster rate to address the issues that we currently see.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And if you do want to check your water meter though, and let us know your personal use, we'll put you onto our league table. We have a seasonal league table, so I was at the bottom last season, so I'm aiming for higher.
Be sure to head back through the archives and check out all the past episodes of Waterfall.
So there we go. Well, I have learned a new thing, sphagnum moss. Never heard of that before, but fascinating. I'm going to try growing that myself. I don't have any blanket peat bogs around me, but I might try anyway.
I think the other aspect of this, which is really, really interesting, is how it's become a really well supported volunteering activity as well. People are really getting involved, and I think that's brilliant.
It is, isn't it? And it was great to hear how so many water companies are involved as well. It clearly makes sense for everybody to care about protecting these peat bogs, not letting it run off into our water supplies. And as we said at the start, not taking the water out of the natural environment. So protecting the environment, saving money, saving water.
Yeah, it's a remarkable organisation, really, that's grown from, a single project manager to a staff of nearly 40 people. I think over 30 million's been spent. And again, like Cath said, like if you want to get involved, we'll put all the links down below. If you want to get into the bogs, and help the moors for the future, then we urge you to.
If people want to get in touch with us, how do they email us, Karen?
They can. We're really keen to hear from people. So if you want to email us, it's podcast@ccwater.org.uk.
And Tom, I'm going to hand to you for social media.
Social media, Waterfall pretty much across everything. Waterfall Podcast, I should add. We are on X, we are on Threads. Yes, as I said in the intro, we've got so many episodes on so many different topics. We are pretty much at the end of season 3 now, which is crazy to think about. We've even got a live episode in there as well. Various ones are, in different places, on locations. So yeah, that's all for today's jam-packed episode of Waterfall. We, of course, will be back next week. I keep telling you to go through the archives, but definitely do go through those archives. And it's a farewell from me, producer Tom.
Goodbye from me, Karen.
And goodbye from me, Cath.